Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I'm, of course, Josh Bycer, and we have another developer interview lined up this week. My guest is the developer of the game Fights in Tight Spaces, a game that looks to combine deck building roguelike with kind of the spy or action movie thriller. We've played it several times on stream, and at the time of this recording, it is going to be entering early access probably very soon from the time you are watching this. And we had the developer on to talk a little bit about the design of the game as well as what's coming in the next few months. So please welcome from Ground Shatter, James Parker. How are you doing, James?
Very good, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. It's very nice.
Not a problem. It is great to have you on. We are recording this, like I said, about a week or so just before the game hits early access. So definitely congratulations on the early access release.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a funny time to be making games and releasing games, but yeah, I'm pleased with the team and how we've kind of pulled through and been able to kind of shift how we've worked and actually get something out. It's quite the event.
Great to hear. A few months ago, I spoke with Paul from Mode 7, and we were talking a little bit more about uh, his company and doing more indie publishing, and he, of course, mentioned Fights in Tight Spaces. And since then, I've had a chance to play it several times, and I really enjoyed it. And for those of you new watching this, I have certainly played quite a bit of roguelikes and roguelites in the last few years. My third book is on roguelike design, so it has been a very interesting genre. So, to get things started with for our cast, since this is your first time on, could you talk a little bit about your background? And for people watching, what is Fights in Tight Spaces?
Yeah, sure. So I've been kind of professional games developer for just over 20 years. I've worked through a bunch of kind of different size companies in the UK, working on a kind of huge variety of different games, shooters and platformers and karaoke games and puzzle games and things like that. And 6 or 7 years ago, I started up my own company, which is Grand Shatter. And the aim was always really just to kind of make games that I would want to play, and kind of been inspired by kind of different games that had influenced me kind of growing up and through my career. So the first game that we released as Grand Shatter was called Skyscrappers, which is a kind of multiplayer platform fighting game where you were fighting your way to the top of a collapsing building. And then 2 years ago, we released Rico, which was a co-op first-person shooter about kicking doors and shooting bad guys, and that had kind of procedural level generation and split screen and online multiplayer and lots of fun stuff like that. And then that kind of brings us to today, and we're kind of launching Fights in Tight Spaces, which is a tactical deck building strategy game where you essentially choreograph an action movie fight. And all of the environments are, as the name suggests, kind of small locations. So bathrooms and elevators and hotel rooms and all the kind of classic places you might have a good old scrap.
Mm-hmm. So, what attracted you to kind of making roguelike or rogue-inspired kind of games?
At least part that's kind of what I've been into recently. It's a nice, from a small developer standpoint, it's quite a nice structure. You can get quite a lot of content out of systems rather than having to build more and more things. And the more your systems layer up, the more opportunities you have for kind of emergence and for player experience to change from run to run. And that's very important in increasing the longevity of the game, but without having to constantly be creating new artwork and new characters and all those things that for a larger company is their kind of bread and butter, but for a small company you really have to maximize on your resources. So there's a bit of pragmatism behind it, but also it's a really interesting and fun design challenge to be able to create those systems and hook into the things that make it enjoyable for people to play time and time again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something that I talked about in my book about that for an independent developer, you can do a lot with a really good procedural or a random generation for a game. Much more so than a AAA in that respect that has to build all those assets and, make sure everything looks super detailed and pretty. While in the independent space, you can rely on a stronger aesthetic, and as you said, get a really solid foundation of those mechanics that can lead to that kind of emergent behavior. And I'm sure, as a fan of roguelike design, you probably have seen stuff like Slay the Spire, Monster Train, even more like action focused designs like Hades, Bind of Isaac, Undermine. It's been a really, I think, rich canvas for a lot of developers to do something different with these kinds of like procedural elements.
Yeah, definitely. And I think they are. I think it's such a broad thing now. The kind of roguelike genre. It's less of a genre and more of a framework that
Mm-hmm.
other game genres can sit within and around. That there's elements of those things that can be incorporated, and I guess have always been part of how people have played games, and they go through waves. So the like permadeath and the principle that you will get better every time you play and you'll start from the start, those harken back to people's experience of playing games in the arcades and coin-ups and
Mm-hmm.
things. That there isn't those aren't necessarily new in themselves, but games are kind of constantly remixing those ideas and pulling them in different ways.
Mm-hmm. And I guess as a question for you regarding kind of like procedural design in general, as you said, your previous game was Rico, and I haven't had a chance to check that one out yet. But you said that also featured procedural design. How, like, any lessons or any tips do you have about doing procedural generation with this being like your second game with this kind of style?
Yeah, so they're kind of different in their approaches to it.
Mm-hmm.
The things that Fights and Tight Spaces works with and randomizes are a lot more to do with player choice. So we have we have 200 cards that are kind of doled out to you as you complete different missions, and then you choose between the very Slay the Spire style, and then in doing so, the player will create a deck that is kind of semi-random based on the choices, but also based on their ideas of what they want to do with their deck. And then the other randomized elements are kind of enemy placement and things like that, whereas the levels themselves are very authored, because that is part of the necessity of the game, is to make the fight spaces interesting and different enough. But because they're very small, there's limited choices with that. So whereas in Rico, we had procedural level generation. So and that was an interesting piece of tech, in the sense that kind of traditional level generation will carve out space, create a room, and there'll be a corridor and there'll be a room, and that, which is kind of fine for dungeons and sci-fi things, whereas Rico's like a modern day shooter, so it needed to feel more like a real building. So we had to create the floor plan of the building and then split that up into rooms so that the rooms made sense to one another. So it felt different from other procedurally generated games. So there was a challenge to do with the aesthetic, to make it feel like a real space, but also to create interesting environments to be having shootouts in, essentially. So they were kind of the lessons we learned from Rico were that fed into Fights were more to do with kind of how we structure player rewards and how to build up tension and difficulty and all of those different things.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, like trying to, I think, focus where you want the procedural elements to be has been a very important aspect of kind of trying to make roguelike design work. And more importantly, I think, to make it structured. So, like, as you said, like, you can have these different situations and different elements, but without it kind of overwhelming the developer in terms of, I need to build, you know, 30,000 different room layouts, and I have to then stitch it all together. Because a lot of people, I think, one of the biggest myths of roguelike design is that, the game builds itself. I just, put all these elements together, let the computer do shuffle, and 1, 2, 3, I have a roguelike done.
Yeah, you definitely change where your work and effort goes completely. So when I was saying before that it takes some of the burden off of the team in terms of creating assets, it moves a load of the burden onto code and design to actually make those systems work and produce interesting results. And having to play it and test it a lot and refine all of those different systems is a huge thing that you wouldn't necessarily have to do in the same way on a linear, more narrative-y, constructed experience.
Mm-hmm. And I guess keeping with that, in terms of getting the procedural generation, the procedural design to work with fights in tight spaces, any, I guess, interesting challenges or balance issues that came up that you and your team had to figure out in terms of making it all work?
Yeah, so the biggest thing for fights is that we've taken a deck building card game mechanic and we've laid it over a kind of turn-based tactics game. So we've got two big areas kind of merged together in one. And so games like Into the Breach and Hoplite were kind of when we started making fights, that the idea was it would be Into the Breach like or that style of game, and the card element was not part of the design from the very start. It was introduced sometime in as a consequence of kind of seeing how we could put constraints on the character or on the player. In the first version of the game, it worked quite well. We had a set of cards, and then you could move around, you could do your attacks, and you could push enemies around, pull them around, all of the elements you've got in now. But it was there was certain ways of playing the game that made it too easy. You could do a couple of hits, then move out of the way, and that would be all that people did, and it became the strategy. And elements of that still exist in the game because it's a game as much about controlling the space as it is about punching people. But we didn't want that to be the only and the most pervasive strategy that people could use. We needed a way to encourage them to use different sorts of cards and to stay put and to be more aggressive with their attacks. So we introduced a combo system, and the combo system builds up when you do attacks and it drops down when you do movement. And that immediately led to a much better balance in terms of the player experience between attack and movement. And then we found that that was when it initially went in, the combos were unlimited. So it ended up with people kind of hoarding moves that would increase your damage based on your combo size. So people would get all of these cards and then they'd end up doing 100 points of damage in one turn, and that would be the end of it. And that became a pervasive strategy. So we then put in a limit on the combo to stop that happening. And so every time you make one of those changes, then a kind of bubble pops up somewhere else that you have to kind of push down. So it's when you're dealing with, in any game where you're dealing with systems that you hope will be interconnected, that's also creates the biggest problems to solve, because whenever you change one thing, it has an influence across all of these other things.
Yeah, and when I first played Fights, this was, I think, 6 months ago. Again, I think the first time it had any demo on Steam, I did notice that movement and pushing enemies was incredibly powerful. I think I finished that demo the very first night that I played it, just by shoving guys out of doors, and that was it. And with the latest one that I played a few weeks ago, with, as you said, with the new combo system and kind of manipulating things around that, it is a lot more interesting to play. And I think that again leads to some of the challenges of procedural design, that you need to give the, I guess, basic building blocks you're giving. There has to be enough depth to them that they can be, stretch and expand out using procedural elements. Because if it's not interesting to play with a fixed pool of cards or a fixed set of situations, it's not going to be made, magically better by just shuffling that up and making it procedural.
That's right. And there's so many aspects of a game like this that kind of prove that point, that we spent a lot of time, myself and Paul, discussing the kind of limits to what cards could do, and there was always a tendency to be quite conservative with that approach and make sure that all of the standard stuff worked and was interesting. But actually, you also need the stuff at the other end. You need strange and unusual cards that don't necessarily have a beneficial effect in themselves, but when combined with other cards, they suddenly do. And that's where you get the interesting interactions that people who have put 20 hours or 40 hours or kind of the people who are really going to stick with the game for a long time are going to be the people who discover those interesting interactions. So you need that whole breadth from the very first time someone plays the game and is wondering how it all works. You need them to have as good an experience then as they do the 100th time they've played it, and they've learned all of the straightforward stuff and they're still delving into the more complex aspects of the game.
Yep. And that level of interaction is very hard to pull off for like any kind of roguelike or roguelite inspired game. Because it is that level of mastery that it has to be kind of like baked into the design for people to discover it. And like you said, if somebody like figures out like the best strategy, and it's the best strategy every time, there's no reason to replay the game. If I know card A, B, and C are always going to be the best ones, and there's no other things I need, why should I keep playing the game? And like getting that level of interactivity between them is very challenging. One thing I like what you just said there about having cards that by themselves serve no immediate purpose, but can then be comboed into other cards or other strategies. I think if I remember right from when I played the demo, I think you had cards that either allow you to like rapidly build up a combo. I think the one that saw it to me the most from when I first played the game to the last time was the counterattack card, where you play the card, it gives you a level of defense, and then you purposely let an enemy hit you, and you respond with a counterattack that does more damage than what you would have blocked.
Yeah, and that's a really cool mechanic. Which is a nice thing as a designer is when you've got something that works mechanically but is thematically absolutely spot on as well. Mm-hmm. So in a game about action movie fights, you don't want your action movie character to never take any hits, because that makes them a kind of impossible Superman, and there's no jeopardy there. You want Tom Cruise to be smashed through a window. You want Jason Statham to be hit around the head with a bat before he eventually takes over. Like you want a bit of to and fro to make it an interesting fight. So the counter system allows that, and like you say, it creates a whole new strategy where if you're surrounded by guys, the natural thing to do would be to move out of the way. But actually, if you play a counter card, then every one of those attacks is going to be counterattacked. So you can do proportionally more damage overall that turn if you are willing to accept a bit of health knock. Mm-hmm. But in turn, you might knock out 2 or 3 guys in one turn. So yeah, it's one of those things that just fits in really well and provides a nice new element. And then you have cards that encourage enemies to attack, which previously you would have thought, why the hell would I want to do that? But you load yourself up with some counters, you taunt them, they come and attack you, you beat them up, and that all happens on your turn, and then you can carry on with your taking out the other guys. So it's another thing that allows the broader deck to suddenly have additional purpose.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back to what you were talking about with Paul, like in terms of like design the game and coming up with like, the basic structure, what was kind of the discussion regarding difficulty? Because that's always a very interesting conversation when it comes to roguelike and roguelike design titles. Because again, permadeath always adds, I think, a certain spice in terms of difficulty. There's no way to get around that. But design the game in terms of, I guess, how spiky you want success and failure to be is often a very difficult part of this design.
Yeah, and it's definitely been one of the things that has kind of tracked on a bit of a sine wave as time has gone on, where we've refined certain elements, we've changed how mechanics work. Even small changes can suddenly shift the balance in favor of the player or against them. Like, for example, we had a stun card, which there's a throat punch where you chop someone in the neck and they're stunned, which means they can't act on their turn. And a variety of different sorts of stuns. But yeah, originally you could do that on any enemy at any time, and it would stun them. It would be quite powerful. We then changed it so you could only cause stun if that attack also did damage. So if someone had block, then their block would be taken down, but they wouldn't be stunned. So that is the thing that from a player's point of view makes them less powerful. But from an overall game balance point of view, is much better. So when we made that change, we also made some changes so that the enemies who would give you injury cards wouldn't do so if you had block. So there's always little tweaks that you can do to help out. And I think for us, the difficulty has been trying to create a difficulty curve for an imaginary audience for the people who we hope will play the game. And that's from people who may not have played a game of this genre before, because we've kind of styled it to make it attractive to a wider audience than people who go, ooh, it's a deck building card game. We're kind of saying this is an action movie simulator, so we need to bring those people into it, and we need it to start off in a way that they can enjoy and not feel frustrated by. As I said before, we also want people to play it for a long time, so we need the tail end of the game where people are going to really have plowed a load of hours into it to be a real challenge. So there's people on our Discord channel who have beaten the game, and I don't think I have yet beaten the game in its current iteration, because it is tuned for the people who are that invested in it, who are more invested in it than I am, because I don't have the time to do that. I've got to make the game, but they are playing the game as much as I'm making it, and they're refining their strategies for the later enemies, who are designed to surprise you in ways. So you'll think you've come up with a strategy at the end of the second mission. You'll be like, oh, well, this is easy. I can beat every level like this. And then we'll throw in an enemy who has abilities that you can't use those strategies on. So it's kind of an arms race, really. It's like someone on the Discord discovers a strategy that it's too powerful, and we either nerf the cards that make that too powerful, or we introduce new enemies that are counter to that. So there's a kind of cyclical nature, and having those really kind of core testers on the game has been invaluable to tuning the difficulty, because it means we kind of understand how far players are getting at different points in that journey through playing the game.
And what you said there about, how much to balance the strategy, I think is another very interesting concept. It's something that I noticed when I spoke with Brian Cronin, who worked on Monster Train, that we got into that discussion about how do you balance these potential strategies. Because like you said, if a strategy can work the same way every time and it's always great, the game becomes boring. But if you have a strategy that can't work, then it's just a wasted card or a wasted set of cards. What was kind of, I guess, the line that you want to walk in terms of, is this too good? Is it too bad? Is it just right?
I think what's good about fights for me is that I can watch someone play it on a stream or like a YouTube video, and they will look at a situation and go, "This is impossible. I can't do anything here. I'm definitely going to die." And I can look at their cards and say, "Well, what they could have done is play this and this and this and got out of that situation, or won in the previous turn, or anything like that." That there's enough kind of space in and around the game for people to fail and it be their own fault, and that's what you want in a game. You don't want people coming away from games saying, "Well, that's stupid. That was completely unfair. The game is broken. It was all the game's fault." Whereas if someone comes away from a game going, "Oh, I could have done that better. I could have, if I played this last time, I would have won." That as long as you always feel that the mistakes were your own and that the deck isn't completely stacked against you, then that's fine. You can. I want people to go wrong because it will make them better next time. So I'm kind of happy for people to have a suboptimal experience sometimes if it means that next time they'll have an even better time. If you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. That we don't. There's no. All of the cards in the game have a purpose. Both individually and as part of the kind of wider spectrum of things. And there's combinations that we probably haven't even thought of that will develop. So there's never really anything that we kind of just throw in because it's a kind of trap for the players who would be like, "Haha, you've picked the worst cards in the deck." Because there isn't necessarily worse cards. There's some weaker cards and some stronger cards, but the weaker cards are cheaper, so you can play them more often, or you need them at the start of the game and you can get rid of them because you've got a more powerful card later. We want to give the player enough tools to develop their own strategy, and some of those strategies will work and some of those strategies won't work.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, you really do have to be careful, because I've seen developers kind of fall into that trap of they'll introduce something that it's so niche in terms of how success will work that it just doesn't have any long-term viability to it. And I guess I was going to say this question for later, but I think this could be a good time to ask it. In terms of the player restarting or replaying fights, are there any kind of like persistent elements or anything that unlocks in subsequent plays of the game?
Yeah, what we have at the moment, what we have kind of at the start of early access is when you play the game the first time, you only have one possible starter deck, but then as you play through the game and reach certain thresholds, you unlock different starter decks. So they are kind of by their nature slightly more advanced, which is why we don't give them to people straight away. We want to give them a kind of balanced experience, and then we introduce a deck that's more about countering, and one that's more about being super aggressive, and then one that's got a bit more kind of tricksy elements to it. So as the player gets more familiar with kind of the styles of play, then we give them the opportunity to start the game more along those different routes, and then to refine their decks as they play as normal. And we also let people, once they've completed various missions, to start the game further on, which makes it more difficult because they don't get the kind of build up, but it means people can jump in and experiment with things a bit more quickly. And I think as time goes on in early access, we will develop that unlocking thing so that we give players more opportunities to play with some of the more powerful cards earlier in the game. We'll do a slightly more progressive unlocking system.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to kind of more of the balance of the game, you've mentioned a few times about enemy designs and using them to kind of counter or be set up to engage with the player's own strategies. What was kind of like the overall philosophy that you wanted to have in mind in terms of how hard to make the enemies, or what kind of specific tactics that they could use that maybe the player can't? Or, there has to be a different workaround to fight them.
Yeah, so there's... The enemies have kind of, by the nature of the kind of 1v many aspect of the game, there are a number of enemies with sort of support functions who will boost the health of all their gang, or increase the damage of all their gangs. So those are the sorts of enemies who you want to take out quickly. Otherwise, you're just going to be fighting an uphill battle against everyone else. So as soon as they come along, that introduces an element of choice between which enemies you're going to attack in which order. Whereas previously, if you were only dealing with a handful of guys, then you could just fight whoever's nearest. As soon as you have enemies that will boost the health of everyone every couple of turns, then you have to concentrate on taking them out first. Otherwise, all of your efforts with the other guys are going to be wasted. So there's elements like that. There's kind of ranged attacks. There's enemies which will counter. There's enemies which will auto-attack, who, if you stand in front of them or take an action in front of them, they will attack immediately. And that's a kind of interesting dynamic to add partway in, because you go from a situation where the player is completely, essentially safe on their whole turn, and then they press end turn and the enemies take all those. As soon as an enemy can attack during your turn, then it brings a whole new element of planning. And also it gives you a new tool to use, because if you can push an enemy into their attack zone, then they'll get attacked just as much as you would. So you have the different enemy behaviors become, as much as anything, tools that you can use as a player to take out other bad guys.
Mm-hmm. And from what I played of the demo, I think that takes you through like kind of like the first chapter of the game with kind of the biker gang. Anything you want to spoil or tease players with in terms of some like the later enemies and of what they'll do to you?
Oh wow, we've got all sorts. So yeah, bikers, prisoners, ninjas, gangsters, and then some interesting combinations of all of them. Yeah, we kind of throw a lot of classic action movie enemies at you, and yeah, they each gang has its certain characteristics as well that you kind of get used to, and then once you start mixing the gangs up, then you get combinations of potential enemy types that are in themselves interesting new challenges and new ways to have to kind of deal with those situations.
Mm-hmm. Are there any plans to introduce like unlock cards, or you mentioned of course the different templates you can begin with? Anything in terms of like new cards or new modifiers that can be introduced into the game?
Yes. We're not necessarily committing to anything specific, but yeah, undoubtedly more cards will come along. We have enhancements, which are our equivalent of relics, which are kind of permanent kind of buffs, or in the case of kind of long-term injuries, those are kind of debuffs to various stats, and also to have influence over the metagame as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's huge scope for increasing that area of the game. We have a bunch of those already, which kind of change up how you can play, but there's a huge scope for new ones of those. Now we understand more about how the game works. It's the more stuff I put in, ironically, the more opportunities I see kind of around the edges of those new mechanics and new cards, and like suddenly there'll be a whole kind of set of ideas that lend themselves to new ways of playing or new kind of classes of card.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, like from the last time I played, I noticed more of the kind of ways you can upgrade your character, as you said, like kind of the analog of the artifacts from Slay the Spire. And it is very interesting to see how all these elements come together in terms of creating a varied experience. And I guess that takes to another question I want to ask you. In terms of like length of a playthrough of Fights in Tight Spaces, again, the demo that I played was just kind of like the first chapter. How long is kind of like the intended run of the game supposed to be for each play?
That's a really difficult question, because I play really fast. Like I would rather kind of rattle through and kind of play by instinct, and I know some other people will stop and stare at the screen for minutes at a time while they plan out their next sets of moves. But yeah, ideally people would spend a couple of hours kind of doing a run, I think that's a kind of a nice sweet spot for a kind of game session, and people can kind of save and load and come back, and just depend on how well people are getting on and how fast they want to play.
All right. Another thing I want to ask you about, in terms of like the different room types or the room situations. From the demo, I know you have kind of the general fight, you have the quote unquote like boss encounters, and you have like save the ambassador kind of missions. Are there any other kinds of, I guess, situations you have planned for the early access and beyond?
Yeah, we have a couple of other things. I don't know if I'll spoiler them. Yeah. Yeah, it just there's some kind of twists on the protection missions, and there's various other objectives that we throw in to kind of keep the levels varied, and also give you the opportunity as a player to gain other rewards. So to maximize a run, to give yourself the biggest chance to win at the end game, you really need to make sure that you're hitting all of those objectives every time you play. Otherwise, you're not going to build up enough currency to upgrade your cards, or you're not going to gain health benefits, or all of those things. So suddenly adding a like a time limit. It's a soft time limit, so you can take longer. Like we set a turn count, and if you complete the level within that turn count, you get a bonus, and those bonuses can be the difference between affording extra health or an upgrade or whatever. So they're definitely worth pursuing if you're that sort of player.
And speaking about the upgrades, every game that kind of, or every kind of like deck builder or roguelike style game that has like an upgrade system, it's always very interesting about how that balance works. You know, how much can you upgrade cards? Can you give them additional functionality? Can you talk a little bit about what was the overall strategy or plan you and your team had for, I guess, how much of an impact the upgrade system has?
Yeah, it's a really good question. For me, the main benefit is that it helps you avoid kind of stagnation. So you don't want players to have to necessarily, if they don't want to, you don't have to kind of churn through cards. I know that's quite a popular strategy in Slay the Spire, is very lean decks, is trying to get the perfect combination of cards in the smallest number of cards, and that way you've got kind of a huge level of control over kind of how fights play out. But not everyone plays that way, so we wanted to give the scope for people to keep their starting cards throughout the game, and therefore having upgrades means those cards can stay relevant. That if you can pay a bit to upgrade them, or you can upgrade them through events, then suddenly you've got a card which was useful at the start and also is useful somewhere into the game. And the system that we've got kind of behind the scenes is really flexible, and that's really nice, because it means from a design point of view, I can look at two cards that, we had this happen the other day, that there were two cards that were quite similar in execution, and we were thinking of whether we needed them both. But actually, as soon as you introduce upgrades, then you can make one of them more powerful and one of them cheaper, and suddenly you've got two cards that kind of become distinct as a consequence of the upgrade system, even if they're not immediately obviously distinct when you first get them.
And I think that's one of my favorite things about kind of like deck building style roguelikes, that you can't really do the same way in like an action or more of an RPG style one, is getting upgrades that let you reduce the costs of a card or of an ability. Because it's one of those things that I think to the outsider it doesn't sound all that important. This requires 3 mana, now only requires 2. Why would anyone want that? But one of the things, like anyone who's played these kinds of games knows, that your kind of energy pool, it dictates your entire turn. So if you can take a card that take it from 1 cost to 0, suddenly you can now play an additional card. And like from like designing the cards, I think that's another interesting topic I wanted to touch on for a few minutes. What was kind of like how did you go about designing and balancing the cards that are in fights in tight spaces?
Yeah, well, that's the cards are really the core of the game. So it's a kind of multi-pronged approach because everything's animated. Like we have 3D animations for all the attacks. That suddenly creates quite a big overhead to any new move in a kind of traditional fighting sense. So there was obviously there was a set of stuff that we knew we wanted that we had to have thematically, and like the basics. You have a punch, and you have a longer punch, and you have a kick, and you have a side kick, and all of these kind of standard things. And then you start to expand on that and say, well, actually, it would be good to have a card that you attack and you move back. So we added the flash kick, or a card that attacks people in either direction. So you have a split kick. And so there was the first step is certainly for the fighting moves is to think about what you want it to do mechanically, and then think about if there's a way to do that visually and kind of with a fighting move. And then there's a layer on top of that where we have the defend type moves and special moves that don't necessarily have an animation attached, don't have a specific animation attached, that can do more stuff that is kind of more stats based or status based. And we can kind of show those off with effects, which kind of a more traditional deck builder game would do. And so in terms of balancing all of those cards against each other, it's quite you have to look at it very specifically when you're editing card, but you also have to look at it holistically when you're deciding whether there's any gaps left. That, as much as anything, it's making sure that we haven't missed any obvious opportunities to do interesting things with the game, because no player is going to get all of the cards on every run. So you don't have to balance for a specific set of things occurring. You just have to kind of take an approach that says this card is not so much better than all the other cards that it's a no-brainer that you would choose it. You want the opportunity for a player to see that as an option and go, right, I can take that card, or I can take a different card that maybe a completely different card that is a counter but fits in a gap in their current hand, or a super powerful headbutt type move. But like the choices are, everything needs to be within the same value space to a player potentially, and there'll be some people who never use a certain set of cards, and that's fine, and there'll be an exact number of people who won't use any of the other set of cards. So it's about giving meaningful choices.
And like you said, you're never going to have a play where you're going to get every card. And that's kind of the benefits of this kind of roguelike design, is that you don't need to worry about how, what happens if everyone gets, all 150 cards in my game. That's never going to happen. And it's really about making each kind of build, in a matter of speaking, pop. Like, I think about something like with Monster Train, and each champion, each faction, having its own specific pool of cards, or its own style. So one is all about, being able to enhance attack. Another is about thorn damage or reflect damage. And the beauty about it is that you can balance each kind of strategy within the confines of that specific build. And then you can open up the door for more advanced play by taking, a few cards from strategy A, a few cards from strategy B, and then seeing how they interact with each other.
Yeah, and Monster Train is I've barely had a chance to kind of get into the depths of that game. It's I'm a simpleton when it comes to Monster Train, but yeah, so Slay the Spire does it really well in terms of having those kind of the initial characters with their styles of play, and then it throws all of that out the window and goes, actually, you can all have all of this stuff. Now see what interesting builds you can get out of that. And I like that approach. And I don't, from a fundamental point of view, I don't mind if someone finds a powerful combination and has a really good time during one run of the game. That's nice, because as a game designer, that's someone who's discovered a thing and enjoys it as a consequence. And I think, and next time they won't get that situation, they'll have to find another way of doing it. So all of those things are this style of game design, because it's about giving the player possibilities and letting them run with it. The most heartening thing is when people discover stuff on their own that we haven't even thought about. So yeah, it's nice.
Yeah. And that's always an issue that I think I see from a lot of like roguelikes or roguelike inspired games that don't necessarily work for me, is when there are choices that, as we've said earlier, that they just seem naturally suboptimal to the play. Like, I've seen games that they'll introduce, common, rare, epic cards or common, rare, epic strategies, and the situation always comes down to, if your common stuff should be just immediately replaced, it's just not good, why should I ever be excited to see that come up in a store or a chance to upgrade those when I get, the legend version that is like 5-10 times better than what those were?
Yeah, and and that kind of fits in again with the theme of the game. We want the player to feel like a super cool spy, secret agent ass kicker. Like, we don't want people to start the game with really kind of limp attacks, because that's not what the game's about. The game is about kicking people all over the place. So there's a couple of cards that you start with in the basic deck, which are absolute staples that are incredibly useful throughout, because for whatever reason they are kind of things that you will always need because of the nature of the game. So yeah, we certainly don't envisage people kind of clearing out their starter deck just so they can get access to the good stuff later on, because everything is good in its context.
So I think with that, I need to ask you, what is like your favorite build or strategy when you play through fights?
It's a good question. It's varied over time. At the moment, I'm leaning towards the kind of super aggressive decks where you can take people out very quickly. And I don't know whether that's a consequence of me needing to play the game more and therefore get through it more. So I want to do as much damage as quickly as I can so I can get onto the later levels. But yeah, and also it gives access to some of the cooler moves. You can run along walls and punch people in the face, and some of the kind of more extreme action movie inspired moves are in that sort of area. So I'm kind of attracted by that as well, because it makes for nice replays as much as anything.
Great. In terms of time, we are about 50 minutes in. I think I have a few more questions for you, then we'll talk more about kind of what's coming with the early access release, and then we'll kind of go into our wrap up. So maybe another 20 to 30 minutes if that works for you.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. So getting back to kind of more of the overall design of fights and where it's at now, what you have planned. With one thing I noticed from the last festival or the last demo that I didn't see before was the idea of having these little mini event system or mini events that can show up. You're in a car, you decide to headbutt the guy, pay money to get out, risk an injury, things like that. Where did that system come from in terms of designing the game?
I think that was a way to kind of reward players and with stuff that we couldn't give them necessarily in other ways. So you can earn kind of cheap upgrades if you're willing to take the risk. So it's a very quick bit of risk reward. And we can do slightly deeper stuff with that system as well. So if you make certain decisions early on in the game, then those characters will come back later in the game and you'll potentially get a bigger reward. So that's quite important in terms of just giving. It's just a kind of narrative niceness to it. It's a bit of world building, but also it's a slightly different avenue for players to take if they want to kind of mix things up a bit and have that risk reward, but in a snappier moment than having another fight.
Mm-hmm. I guess with that said, are there any other aspects from a design standpoint of fights that we haven't touched on yet that you would like to discuss?
I suppose that the kind of environmental stuff's interesting because part of the interesting part of the game is that it's about controlling the space, and that comes down to the fact that there are sometimes kind of ring out tiles, so you can maneuver enemies towards them and push them out of the level, and that's like an instant kill. There's moves that are reliant on you being next to walls, so there's kind of environmental head bashes and running along the wall and jumping off the wall and doing various kind of environmental attacks, and that adds an element to the game that you don't get in kind of the more kind of traditional pure deck building type games. So we have the added element of manipulating the space. So you can, as well as moving yourself around, you can move enemies around, you can push them into each other, you can make them attack each other, you can force them out of the arena. So all of those different things inform the card design, and the level design influences then how you play. So you could have set up a deck that's all about pushing enemies out of the level. As soon as you're confronted with a level with no doors or railings or any of the areas where you can push them out, then suddenly you need to rethink your own strategy. So it's another way of us kind of balancing the whole experience throughout and not making certain strategies kind of overwhelmingly powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the original idea for the game was about fighting in tight spaces. That before the cards and everything came along, that it was wanted to explore the ideas that having a very limited play area in a tactical game would give us. And when we started out, I was like, oh, we'll probably have arenas that are kind of 8x8 tiles. That feels about right. That's the size of a chessboard or size of a Into the Breach level, and that's probably going to be right. And actually, we've gone even tighter than that. Our levels are all smaller than that generally. So that was a kind of interesting realization that we could get away with having. And it sounds stupid because that's the name of the game, but I never thought we could get away with having a 3x3 level, and we can. Like, we've got these fights to take place in a lift, which is 3x3 tiles with one doorway, and you have to change how you play. But it's a really interesting, suddenly going from the relative kind of vastness of a 6x6 level suddenly to 3x3 level. You've got to really know how to manipulate that space, because otherwise you're going to get kicked around every turn.
Mm-hmm. And that actually reminds me, I mentioned what my favorite strategy was. That, like, for me, when I played fights, I like, as you said, like manipulating like the space around, like getting cards so that you dodge around enemies or pass through them. I think one of my favorite ones was I was surrounded by like 3 enemies and the boss, and I moved around the guy, pushed him into my spot, so the boss was like a wind-up punch and knocked all 3 of those enemies down as a single hit. And then on the following turn, all I did was did a forward push kick. I just kicked him out the door, and I won the battle in 2 turns.
Yeah, and that's really nice. I think the using enemies against each other is such a cool kind of staple, particularly of kind of martial arts films as well. Mm-hmm. It's like another nice thing to be able to include. People kind of, it's the thing that people expect to see, but mm-hmm. that also informs interesting game mechanic.
Mm-hmm. So I think with that, let's talk a little bit about what's coming with the early access. So as we said earlier, the game is going to be out on early access on February 24th. And for those of you watching or listening to this interview, this cast should be going up around that same time. I still have to plan things out on this front. So one question I always like to ask developers, especially when they take a game that was either not available in early access or was developed, before that plan. what led to Fights in Tight Spaces going on to early access now? Like, specifically, like, what is the state of the game for people wanting to pick this up next week?
Yeah, it's the reason we chose an early access is not because the game isn't finished. I think it's that the game has a load more to offer. So, we're at the stage where we really want people to kind of invest in it, and so we can to some extent inform our decisions based on how people respond to this version of the game. So it's got the kind of complete campaign of missions. It's got all of the cards. It's got the enemy characters all are implemented. There's probably going to be a few bugs to iron out with certain combinations of cards that we've not anticipated, but like it's super solid. We've had loads of time to work on it specifically to get it to a stage where people can pick up the early access version and not worry about any of that stuff and just play it as like a released game. But knowing that over the next few months, however long it takes, it'll go towards a version 1, and that will incorporate a ton of the feedback that we get, and it'll give us the opportunity to see how players are playing it and doing things that we don't expect, and then we can add whatever they want and need to kind of fill it out in other directions or add whole new elements. Like people on the Discord are already suggesting really cool stuff that we'd love to do, but it kind of was out of scope of the game in the first place. But if it's successful in early access, that gives us a huge amount of potential to take it in new directions and add whole new areas of the game that we would kind of always have liked to do, but for whatever reason didn't make it into this initial version.
Mm-hmm. And that actually is another question I want to ask you about. As we said, like, Fights in Tight Spaces was first part of, I want to say, was the Summer Festival. Again, 2020, 2021 is like a very weird time in terms of understanding dates and such. But the game was originally available there in, like, very basic version. And then a few weeks ago, you put out the Prologue edition. And what I just want to ask you about was, how did, the demo and the Prologue kind of, like, help in terms of getting the word about fights? Because I know there are still some developers who struggle with the idea of, do I want to do a demo for my game? Do I want to do a prologue? And I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Certainly for us, both the demo festivals and the prologue have been really good for us in terms of increasing the visibility of the game. And at least partly that's because people have responded really well to the prologue. It's got overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam, and that's amazing. That's really nice for me and for the team to see how much people like the game, and hopefully that'll drive more people to the game when it comes out in early access. But yeah, it's though because of the size of the studio and the style of the game it is, we needed kind of word of mouth to be the big selling point for it. So or the big way that we got new sales, and it's a very stylized game and it's very striking, and so it's good on social media. But actually having to go from that to having people wishlist the game and ultimately to buy the game, having a demo means that people will understand it better. We can say what it is and we can show what it is in a video, but none of those things compare to actually playing the game and having that realization of going, oh, it's kind of this thing meets this thing, but it works. Whereas me saying, oh, it's Into the Breach meets Slay the Spire meets the Mission Impossible bathroom fight, it's it's a good tagline, but it's not. It doesn't compare at all to someone sitting down in front of it on their own and going, right, I get it now. This is how this combination of things works. So yeah, I can understand why people don't want to do it for all sorts of reasons, but particularly in our case, it was really useful to let people kind of play around with the concept and realize what it is, and hopefully to then want more of it.
Mm-hmm. And what you said there about explaining the game to somebody, I think it's a very interesting point. I'm at the time of this recording, I'm working on a video topic on demos and pros and cons of them. And one of the big things is about showing something that's either esoteric or not easily explained to a player, like puzzle games, strategy, anything that you can't just say, okay, it's like Mario, or, this is Dark Souls but in 2D. And I think one of the strengths that we've seen with prologues and demos, especially of like anything that has like roguelike elements to it, is that I think it creates a very attractive package for the consumer that, again, the beauty of a roguelike, it's meant to be replayed. So if you like the demo, it's not automatically over when you get to the end. You can reload it, get another batch of content, and try it again there. And then further still, again, with something like with fights, that watching screenshots of the game or watching like a trailer doesn't quite tell you, okay, what is going on in this game. And I've seen many indie developers struggle with that they'll put out just trailer footage and it's like, what is this? Like, yes, you're showing ships flying and things exploding, but I have no idea what any of this stuff is actually going to mean in game. And the demo will kind of answer those questions for you.
Yeah, we were careful with our trailer in the first place as well to actually show gameplay. It's very easy to just show off the flashy stuff, but the nature of the game meant that we wanted people to know that it was a card game and a tactics game all roll into one. We still showed off the flashy stuff as well, but I think that was a very kind of like, and it wasn't necessarily a decision that we made, but it was a good thing that happened, that when we did that, a load of people kind of saw the trailer and replied and said, we really appreciate you showing us what the game is, because we realize that this is kind of our thing, rather than if it had just been a really nicely choreographed fight sequences, it would have looked cool and people would have gone, "Oh, that looks like an exciting game." But that audience the audience that like the genre of game that we're making wouldn't have necessarily seen it and understood that we were making a game for them.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that you mentioned that I want to touch on, because I almost forgot to ask you about, is the aesthetics of fights. It's very stylized. What kind of, the black and white silhouettes. I think a lot of people kind of describe it like very like super hot-esque in terms of like that initial look. Where did the art for fights come from in the first place?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we first pitched it to Paul, we had a video demo-y thing that used a load of assets from Rico. So it was a much more kind of realistic, slightly cel-shaded look fight in a kind of fully realized bathroom. And then we kind of all agreed that wasn't quite right, that we needed to do something more stylized. So Dave, who's my lead artist, went away and kind of came up with various different potential approaches, and we tried them out. We just replaced all the art in the original video and to see how it looked. And he hit upon this. He looked at a load of kind of classic movie titles, so all the work that Saul Bass had done, and they're kind of very recognizable, kind of as a style, and that kind of really jumped out. And as soon as we started kind of applying those ideas to how the characters looked, then it all kind of fell into place. And we went with the white environments, with the very kind of striking character art. And it gives it feels like lots of different things. So it feels like movie titles, and it feels like a board game, and it's got all of those different elements that kind of are evocative of certain things, but also it's really clear and it makes playing the game much easier. So the UI fits around it, and everything just kind of, as soon as he had that idea and we started working on it, then everything just kind of fell into place, and it just kind of naturally became the style of the game.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I also wanted to touch on, like for people listening or watching, that I really like when you do kind of the action shots, like when you show like the camera zoom in when you do. I forget the exact word for it, when you like grab the guy and you slam them into a wall, like that special kind of like takedown move. And it's like touches like that I think really help to elevate these kinds of games. It reminds me a lot of like that, I guess, that sense of motion like Darkest Dungeon had, when like you saw like camera animations and the camera would zoom in during combat. That it doesn't sound all that interesting on paper or to somebody who's just playing the game, but it kind of helps to, I think, make these games more, I guess, digestible in terms of, repeated runs of it.
Yeah, we want people to feel cool when they're playing it. We want them to kind of enjoy the experience of it, kind of viscerally, rather than just kind of in a kind of logical way. So, so we put the camera cutaways in as a way to just go, well done, you've done something cool. Here's your reward, which is seeing it play out in a more exciting way than just from a kind of isometric perspective. And you can turn that off if you want to play it in a very cerebral way and just kind of play your cards and see how it turns to play out. But I think for a lot of people, that's one of the things that makes it an interesting game, is that we have that system, and then when you finish a fight, you can watch a replay of the whole fight, but essentially in real time. So you don't have any of the card stuff, and all the UI goes away, and you just see all the action, and that's all strung together. And there's various different options for which cameras you see that through as well. So you then get the fight that you choreographed basically played out for you, and that's, I think, a lot of people who saw the game initially were like, we hope there's going to be a replay so you can see the whole fight. So we increased the importance of that, and like now it's working really well.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to kind of the early access of the game, in terms of playing through it, as I said earlier, like for people picking it up on day one, how much of the game is kind of like done in terms of like the campaign or overall structure?
It's pretty much all there, and it's people can play through. We've got the beta testers have been playing for many hours before they've got to the end, before they've seen the kind of the final win screen, and even then they're going back and playing from the start in different styles. So there's a chunky amount of content. There's plenty for people to see and do, and I think anything that we add on after this point is going to be extra, is going to be above and beyond what people would expect for a game of this kind of size and scope. It gives us a framework for adding things on in future based on what people kind of want to see. But if people aren't interested in any of that aspect of things, if they buy the early access version, they will have a complete game that they can go away and play for as many hours as they want, basically, because it's all there and ready for them to enjoy.
Mm-hmm. How long are you planning on doing early access for?
That I don't know at the moment. It depends on a number of factors, but it's not going to be, because the stage we're at the moment, we are, like I say, it's in a really solid state at the moment. So it's not going to be years and years. It's going to be, I don't know, less than that.
All right.
And yeah, you should ask Paul.
There we go. Well, Paul is watching us. If he wants to come back on and chat, let me know. We're always happy to have him back on as well. I guess with the early access itself, I know one question a lot of people always like to ask of games like this. What kind of, feedback or suggestions are you hoping, people will bring to the game? Are there any things, will they be able to, suggest things to be added going forward during the early access?
Yeah, we're definitely keen to hear from people. And we have a Discord that people can join, and we have a suggestions channel on that. there's like with any game development, there's bound to be stuff that people want and that we want that we can't do for one reason or the other. Like I think earlier today, someone was suggesting kind of pick-upable weapons, and that is very cool. But that is a whole thing. That's a complete retooling of the game to make that happen. So that's definitely not going to happen immediately, if it happens at all. But yes, all suggestions are good because if nothing else, it gives us an idea of where the sentiment is in terms of kind of the scale of things that people are after, or the things that they feel are going to make the biggest difference.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got ideas for loads of content, but if no one is interested in that sort of stuff, then that'll take a back burner, and we'll rejig existing ideas to accommodate the suggestions that we're getting in.
Mm-hmm. And as you were describing, like picking up like weapons and stuff, the game Yakuza games like flashing in my head of just like walking around, just like picking up like a random table and just like smashing it into somebody.
Yeah, there's so many great kind of fighting games that do stuff like that, and we come at it from such a weird angle. But there's lots of kind of ideas that I want to take from other fighting games and kind of all of the action movies that inspire us. And I'd love to expand it over time to be able to reflect the wide variety of fighting styles and action movie styles and all of these different things.
Awesome. So I think with that, I am just about out of questions. Anything else regarding early access that we didn't touch on that you'd like to mention?
I don't think so. I think it's we'd love people to obviously play it, and the prologue is there for people to try out the game and get an idea of what it's like. And I think they'll see that, and then the full game is kind of 5 times bigger than the prologue. So if they're finding that they're spending a whole bunch of time in the prologue, then kind of early access is going to be for them, because it's going to unlock so many more cards and more experiences and more enemies and all of that kind of stuff, and they can really invest even more time in that.
Great. So I think with that, I think that should do it, at least for right now. Like I said, definitely a big fan of fights. I've played both the demo and the prologue, and as I said, we're recording this about a week before, or about like 9 days before it goes on to early access. So I'm definitely excited to check things out there. I guess to wrap up our little talk for tonight, anything you'd like to say to the fans watching? Any final thoughts? The floor is yours.
Okay, well, I really appreciate anyone who's played the game so far, who's come on the Discord, given us feedback, or has been on social media. The things that kind of benefit us as an industry are the same that benefit anyone else. So buying the game, playing the game, telling your friends, leaving reviews, all of those things, wish listing the game, all of those things really help us kind of track how well things are doing. And we really appreciate any feedback on all of that stuff. We really, like, I genuinely still get excited if someone is streaming the game and I can go and drop in on the stream and see how people are getting on. And I really love watching people play the game, because I think it's important as a designer to see how people use the things that you create, and kind of it's instructive for me, because it means I can work out how people are playing and see how we can evolve the game. But also, it's just genuinely enjoyable to see that happening.
Great. And I know we have a time zone kind of difference here, but if you ever want to into one of my streams while I play the game, definitely feel free, and you can commentate on how good or bad I'm playing.
I will try and do that.
All right. So I think with that will do it for our talk tonight. Again, James, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you, and if you are free in the future, we can always set up to do another one of these talks. If we get our time zones, all set up, we could possibly do it live and have an audience here to ask us more questions about fighting, tight spaces, and I guess kicking people all over the place.
That'd be great. Thank you very much.
Not a problem. So, for those of you watching this right now, thank you so much for enjoying this cast. As always, check out our Discord and Patreon link down below. If you are a developer working on an upcoming game or just want to talk game design with me, we are always looking for guests for these talks, whether they are live or recorded. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. And until next time, have a great night. Take care.